Hi there, I'm Sam. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. in Seattle. The rain is beating against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a penthouse that costs more than most of us will make in a lifetime. And right there, in the middle of a cold, immaculate kitchen, is a 22-year-old girl named Maya. She's on her hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor, carrying the weight of the world literally on her back. That weight is her 2-year-old brother, Leo, fast asleep against her shoulder. Maya works as a brilliant intern by day and a secret cleaning lady by night just to keep a roof over his head. But here's the kicker. The kitchen she's cleaning belongs to Julian Vance, the 30-year-old ice-cold CEO of the very company she interns for. He's known for firing people over a single spilled drop of coffee. What happens when two completely different worlds collide in the dead of night? Pull up a chair, folks, because this story is going to warm your heart. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments. What city or country are you listening to this story from tonight? And if you enjoy a good tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The rain in Seattle never really stops. It just changes its rhythm. Tonight, it's a steady, cold drumbeat against the glass and steel of the city, blurring the neon streetlights into long streaks of bleeding color on the wet asphalt. It's the kind of night that makes you want to hurry home, lock the heavy door behind you, and completely forget the outside world. But for some people, the dead of night is when the real battle for survival begins. Let's step out of the rain and into a place where the storm is nothing more than a silent movie playing on floor-to-ceiling windows. This is the penthouse of Julian Vance. He stood in the dead center of his massive, immaculate kitchen, a man who looked exactly like the empire he had built. Julian was 30 years old, a man seemingly carved from ice and relentless ambition. He was tall, with a razor-sharp jawline and eyes the color of a winter, overcast sky. He wore his bespoke charcoal suits like a suit of armor against a world he insisted on controlling. He was the CEO of Vance Media, a titan of the digital age, and his need for absolute order wasn't just a preference. It was an obsession, a desperate shield built to keep the unpredictability of human emotion at bay. Julian traced a long, pale finger across the pristine white marble island. He stopped. He stared. There, illuminated by the harsh overhead lights, was a microscopic ring of condensation, barely visible to the naked eye, but to Julian it was a glaring failure. He looked up at Mrs. Gable. She was a frail woman in her late 60s, with a hunch in her shoulders and trembling, veined hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard labor. She was the third housekeeper his agency had sent this month. She stood there, holding a specialized polishing cloth, looking terrified. "You missed a spot." Julian's voice was a flat, ticking clock, devoid of any warmth or anger, which somehow made it infinitely worse. Gable stammered, apologizing profusely, her hands shaking as she reached forward to wipe the counter. "Don't," Julian said, stepping back as if her imperfection might be contagious. "Leave the keys on the console by the door. You'll be paid for the full week." Just like that, without a second glance, she was gone. Julian immediately dialed Sarah, his director of human resources. Sarah was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, angular features and blonde hair pulled tightly into a severe, unforgiving chignon. She survived the corporate Shark Tank by being just as ruthless and unsentimental as Julian himself. Her underlying stress only ever manifested in the constant, anxious tapping of her perfectly manicured acrylic nails against any available surface. "Sarah," Julian said to the phone, his eyes still fixed on the faint water ring, "the penthouse needs a new cleaning service. Immediately. Make it a night shift. When I am home, I don't want to see them. I don't want to hear them. Make it happen." The next morning, the atmosphere inside the towering glass skyscraper of Vance Media was suffocating. The executive boardroom felt more like a bunker under siege. The corporation was bleeding public goodwill. A recent viral expose had branded Julian's company as a soulless corporate machine, an entity described as exploitative, toxic, and entirely devoid of human empathy. The board of directors was panicking, demanding a massive, immediate PR campaign. They needed a miracle to humanize a company that was led by a man who functioned like a microchip. Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face a perfect mask of indifference, while his executives scrambled and shouted around him. Standing quietly in the far corner of that sprawling, high-stakes room, clutching a stack of files, was Maya Hayes. Maya was 22 years old, a young black woman with a spirit that adamantly refused to break, even though the world was certainly trying its hardest to crush her. She had warm, incredibly observant brown eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and her hair was styled in neat, practical locks tied away from her face. She wore an oversized thrift store blazer that she constantly adjusted, attempting to mask the dangerous amount of weight she had lost since her parents passed away in a sudden accident a year ago. She carried a heavy, invisible aura of grief, masked entirely by her sheer, desperate survival instinct. She was just an intern here, entirely invisible to the wealthy titan sitting at the table. Yet Maya clutched a notepad filled with brilliant ideas, concepts about genuine human connection, about rebuilding community trust. Seeing a brief lull in the shouting, she tentatively raised her hand, hoping to offer a fresh perspective. Sarah, who also oversaw the internship program, caught the movement. She shot Maya a withering, venomous glare. "Not now, Maya," Sarah snapped, her acrylic nails tapping irritably against her digital tablet. "We need high-level strategy here, not naive college idealism. Go fetch the updated marketing analytics from the 4th floor." Maya swallowed her pride, the lump in her throat burning. She lowered her hand, nodded silently, and slipped out of the heavy glass doors. In the bustling hallway outside, she accidentally bumped her shoulder against a solid, unyielding figure. It was Julian Vance, stepping out of the room to take a private call. He didn't even look down. He didn't pause. He just brushed past her as if she were a ghost, an irritating speck of dust floating in his immaculate high-stakes world. Maya murmured a quiet apology to his retreating back, her heart heavy with the crushing exhaustion of a girl who was fighting a war on two completely different fronts. Fast forward to midnight. The PR crisis had dragged Julian into endless, agonizing strategy meetings. When he finally keyed the code into his penthouse door, the absolute silence of the massive, dark space usually brought him a sense of cold, familiar comfort. He shrugged off his wet cashmere coat, his shoulders aching, and began loosening his tight silk tie. The storm outside hadn't stopped. The rain drummed endlessly against the glass, a chaotic backdrop to his ordered sanctuary. He walked slowly toward the kitchen, craving nothing more than a glass of ice-cold water and the oblivion of sleep. But as he turned the corner into the kitchen, his polished shoes stopped dead on the hardwood. He froze. The kitchen's under-cabinet lights were dimmed, casting long, soft, golden shadows across the stark white marble. And there, on her hands and knees, scrubbing the very floor he walked on, was the intern from this morning, Maya. She had traded her oversized professional blazer for faded, worn-out jeans and a plain, damp grey t-shirt. She was scrubbing the grout with a desperate, rhythmic intensity, her breaths coming in ragged, tired gasps. But that wasn't what made the air leave Julian's lungs. That wasn't what made his heart skip a sudden, strange beat. Strapped tightly to Maya's back, Wrapped securely in a worn, faded fabric baby carrier was a child. This was Leo. He was a 2-year-old black boy with plump, round cheeks, a little button nose and a head of soft, dark, messy curls. Leo was wide awake. His large, innocent eyes blinked slowly in the dim light. Any normal toddler would be crying, screaming, or fussing at this late hour, frustrated by the cold room and the constant jerky swaying of his sister scrubbing the hard floor. But Leo was unnaturally quiet. It was a tragic, heartbreaking testament to a baby who had learned far too early in his short life that his cries could cost his sister her only lifeline. He just rested his little chin on Maya's shoulder, watching the shadows dance. Julian stood absolutely motionless in the entryway. A storm of violation and sudden anger flared in his chest. His one absolute rule, no strangers, no unpredictability, no chaos in his sanctuary, was being blatantly shattered. He stepped fully into the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile. Maya gasped, dropping the wet sponge. It landed with a soft, soapy slap. She spun around, her eyes widening in sheer, paralyzing terror as she recognized the ruthless CEO of her company standing in his own kitchen. She scrambled backward to her feet, instinctively reaching her hands behind her back to shield Leo from view. "Mr. Vance, I can explain," she stammered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. She looked like a trapped animal, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Julian's cold grey eyes flicked from her terrified, exhausted face to the small boy clinging to her back. He opened his mouth, fully prepared to fire her on the spot. He was going to demand she leave his property instantly, call Sarah, and have her internship terminated by morning. But then little Leo tilted his head. He looked straight up at Julian, the towering, intimidating millionaire who controlled their fate. The little boy didn't flinch, he didn't whimper, he didn't make a single sound. He just stared back with a quiet, profound solemnity, his tiny, dark hand reaching up to grip the frayed collar of Maya's t-shirt. Something in that silent, stoic gaze pierced straight through Julian's expensive armor. For a fraction of a second, the cold CEO didn't see a breach of contract. He saw a flash of his own past, a memory of a lonely, frightened boy in a freezing boarding school hallway, a boy who had also learned that swallowing his tears was the only way to survive. The silence in the kitchen stretched heavy and thick, competing only with the relentless sound of the Seattle rain beating against the glass. Julian slowly shifted his gaze back to Maya. He looked past her intern status. He saw the dark, bruised circles under her brown eyes. He saw the raw, red skin of her knuckles gripping her shirt. The icy anger in his chest slowly dissolved, replaced by a strange, heavy emptiness he hadn't felt in years. "My contract with the cleaning agency explicitly states no unauthorized guests," Julian said. His voice was flat, echoing in the large room, but the lethal cutting edge he normally wielded was entirely gone. Maya bowed her head, hot tears finally welling in her eyes and threatening to spill over. "I know, I'm so sorry, sir. I couldn't afford the night sitter today. Please, don't fire me. From here? Or from the company? We have nowhere else to go. I need this." Julian stared at the two of them. A millionaire standing in his ivory tower and a broken family fighting for crumbs, sharing the exact same cold space. He finally broke the intense gaze, turning his back to her and walking slowly toward the stainless steel refrigerator. He poured himself a glass of water, the clinking of the ice sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. "No noise," Julian said softly. His back still turned to her, staring blankly at the water dispenser. "And when you leave before dawn, I don't want to see a single trace that either of you were ever here. Without waiting for a response, he walked past her, his gaze fixed straight ahead, and disappeared into the dark hallway of the penthouse. Maya stood completely frozen in the center of the kitchen, the breath finally leaving her burning lungs in a shaky, silent sob of absolute relief. She reached her wet hand back, gently patting Leo's soft, curly hair. The long night was far from over, but for now, in the shadow of a cold man's kitchen, they were safe. A strange, unspoken equilibrium settled over the ensuing weeks, splitting reality into two parallel universes that coexisted without ever truly touching. By day, the towering glass monolith of Vance Media was a battlefield, and Julian Vance was its undisputed, ruthless commander. The corporate PR crisis was still a bleeding wound on the company's stock price, and the pressure had turned the executive floors into a pressure cooker. Julian operated from his top-floor glass office like a shark in a high-tech aquarium, moving with lethal efficiency and zero tolerance for mediocrity. He systematically tore through marketing proposals, his voice a flat, freezing whip that left seasoned executives stammering. He demanded perfection, and when he didn't get it, he dismissed people with a simple, chilling flick of his wrist. Down in the sprawling Intern bullpen on the 4th floor, Maya Hayes existed in a state of suspended animation. She sat hunched over a flickering dual-monitor setup, inputting endless streams of analytics data while desperately trying to keep her eyes open. Her body was a leaden weight, her bones aching from the lack of sleep. Whenever Julian strode through the bullpen flanked by his anxious managers, Maya would shrink down in her cheap swivel chair, ducking her head to hide the dark, bruised exhaustion painted across her face. They were planets in the same solar system, kept completely apart by the rigid gravity of the corporate hierarchy. He was the sun that burned everything in its orbit, and she was just trying not to evaporate. But Maya's exhaustion was not born solely from the punishing hours of scrubbing marble countertops. It was fueled by a suffocating, terrifying ticking clock hanging over her small family. Just 2 days prior, the fragile bubble of her life outside the office had been aggressively punctured by a visit from Child Protective Services. Maya lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment in the Rainier Valley district, where the paint peeled in long, sad strips and the radiator clanked more than it heated. It was into this meagre sanctuary that Mrs. Brenda Higgins had walked. Mrs. Higgins was a caseworker in her late 50s, a stout woman built like a filing cabinet, wearing a sensible, worn beige trench coat that smelled faintly of stale coffee and institutional bureaucracy. Years of wading through the tragic, broken underbelly of Seattle's family court system had calcified her empathy. She wasn't an evil woman, but she was deeply cynical, viewing the world exclusively through the rigid lens of risk assessment and state guidelines. Her thick, square glasses rested on the bridge of a sharp nose, and she carried a battered clipboard that she clutched like a shield. During her visit, Mrs. Higgins had walked through the tiny apartment with agonizing slowness, her pen scratching loudly against the paper. She noted the single, rattling space heater, the second-hand crib squeezed into the corner of the kitchen, and the dark circles under Maya's young eyes. "You are 22 years old, Ms. Hayes," Mrs. Higgins had said, her voice completely devoid of inflection. "While I commend your willingness to take in your brother after your parents' tragic passing, good intentions do not pay for groceries or health care. This environment is highly precarious. If you cannot provide documented proof of stable, sufficient income and a more suitable living arrangement within the next 30 days, the state will have no choice but to intervene for the child's welfare." The threat of losing Leo, the only piece of her heart she had left, was a cold blade pressed against Maya's throat. It was the sole reason she forced her trembling legs to stand up, every single day. It was why she endured the silent humiliation at the agency, the brutal intern tasks, and the grueling secret night shifts at the penthouse. She could not and would not let the state take her baby brother. She had to survive. She had to be invisible. And so when the sun set and the rain washed over the city, the second universe clicked into place. At midnight, the Vance penthouse transformed into a stage for their bizarre silent ballet. Julian, plagued by the relentless insomnia of a man whose brain refused to shut down, often found himself sitting in his dark, mahogany-panelled study. The only light in the cavernous room came from the cool blue glow of his laptop screen. From his heavy leather armchair, if he left the heavy oak door open just a crack, he had a direct line of sight into the kitchen. He never announced his presence. He never stepped out to inspect her work. He just sat in the shadows, listening to the soft, rhythmic swish of her mop and the quiet, soothing hum of her voice. One particular night, the silence of the penthouse was broken by a soft, inquisitive babble. Julian paused his typing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He looked through the narrow gap in the door. Maya had paused her cleaning. She was sitting cross-legged on the cold marble floor, the baby carrier loosened so Leo could sit in her lap. The little boy was pointing a chubby finger at the massive kitchen island. Julian squinted into the dim light. Left on a silver platter on the island was a single, thick slice of artisanal sourdough toast, slightly burnt at the edges, Julian's discarded breakfast from that morning. He had been too distracted by a phone call to finish it. Maya looked around nervously, her eyes scanning the dark hallways, terrified of waking the ghost that owned the house. Believing she was completely alone, she reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and snatched the leftover toast. She didn't eat it herself. Instead, she carefully broke off a soft, unburnt piece from the center and held it to Leo's lips. The toddler took it eagerly, chewing with quiet, tired contentment. Maya smiled, a fragile, beautiful expression that Julian had never seen her wear in the fluorescent glare of the office, and whispered something into the boy's hair as she rocked him. Sitting in the dark, Julian felt a sudden, sharp constriction in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was a useless, patronizing emotion. It was an acute, unsettling awareness of the sheer disparity between his world and hers. He threw away food that cost more than she likely made in a day, while she was treating a discarded crust of bread like a hard-won feast for her brother. He looked down at his expensive hands, then back at the girl sitting on his floor, fighting a war he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Julian Vance was not a man given to sentimentality, but the image of that shared piece of toast lodged itself deep in his mind, refusing to be dislodged. The very next evening, on his way home from a grueling board meeting, Julian stopped his sleek black sedan outside a high-end, late-night deli in Belltown. He walked in, his tailored suit drawing curious glances, and ordered a massive gourmet turkey and triple cream brie sandwich on fresh ciabatta, along with a box of delicate French pastries. When he arrived at the penthouse, he ate exactly 1/4 of the sandwich. He then placed the rest of it, along with 2 of the pristine pastries, squarely in the center of the kitchen island. He didn't put them in the trash. He didn't wrap them in the refrigerator. He left them out, arranged with deliberate, unspoken intent, right next to a fresh bottle of spring water. That night, Julian retreated to his dark study, leaving the door cracked open just an inch wider than usual. Hours later, the soft click of the service elevator signaled Maya's arrival. He listened to the rustle of her jacket, the quiet coos of Leo, and then the sudden, distinct pause in her footsteps as she entered the kitchen. Through the crack, Julian watched. Maya stood frozen before the island, staring at the gourmet feast left sitting in the open. She looked around, her brow furrowed in confusion, suspicion warring with blatant hunger. She knew her boss's obsession with a spotless kitchen, leaving food out, was a cardinal sin. Yet there it was. After a long, agonizing minute of hesitation, Leo let out a soft whine. Maya's resolve broke. She reached out, dividing the sandwich, giving the softest parts to her brother before finally taking a bite herself. Julian watched her close her eyes as she tasted the food, a silent sigh of relief escaping her lips. He leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the laptop illuminating a strange, unfamiliar softness in his steely eyes. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions without blinking, but somehow feeding an exhausted intern and her little brother from the shadows felt like the most important deal he had made in years. Something in that silent, stoic gaze pierced straight through Julian's expensive armor. For a fraction of a second, the cold CEO didn't see a breach of contract. He saw a flash of his own past, a memory of a lonely, frightened boy in a freezing boarding school hallway, a boy who had also learned that swallowing his tears was the only way to survive. The silence in the kitchen stretched heavy and thick, competing only with the relentless sound of the Seattle rain beating against the glass. Julian slowly shifted his gaze back to Maya. He looked past her intern status. He saw the dark, bruised circles under her brown eyes. He saw the raw, red skin of her knuckles gripping her shirt. The icy anger in his chest slowly dissolved, replaced by a strange, heavy emptiness he hadn't felt in years. My contract with the cleaning agency explicitly states no unauthorized guests, Julian said. His voice was flat, echoing in the large room, but the lethal cutting edge he normally wielded was entirely gone. Maya bowed her head, hot tears finally welling in her eyes and threatening to spill over. "I know, I'm so sorry, sir. I couldn't afford the night sitter today. Please, don't fire me. From here? Or from the company? We have nowhere else to go. I need this." Julian stared at the two of them. A millionaire standing in his ivory tower and a broken family fighting for crumbs, sharing the exact same cold space. He finally broke the intense gaze, turning his back to her and walking slowly toward the stainless steel refrigerator. He poured himself a glass of water, the clinking of the ice sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. "No noise," Julian said softly. His back still turned to her, staring blankly at the water dispenser. "And when you leave before dawn, I don't want to see a single trace that either of you were ever here." Without waiting for a response, he walked past her, his gaze fixed straight ahead, and disappeared into the dark hallway of the penthouse. Maya stood completely frozen in the center of the kitchen, the breath finally leaving her burning lungs in a shaky, silent sob of absolute relief. She reached her wet hand back, gently patting Leo's soft, curly hair. The long night was far from over, but for now, in the shadow of a cold man's kitchen, they were safe. The corporate crisis at Vance Media had evolved from a localized panic into a full-blown inferno, and the desperate need for a solution birthed a rare event within the company's rigid walls, an anonymous, company-wide idea competition. The initiative was spearheaded by Marcus Thorne, the chief marketing officer. Marcus was a man in his early 50s who clung to his fading youth with aggressively dyed jet-black hair and overly tight bespoke Italian suits that strained against his midsection. He possessed sharp, ferret-like features and a permanent cynical sneer, a defensive mechanism born from a spectacular, humiliating dot-com startup failure in his 20s that left him permanently terrified of unproven, emotional concepts. To Marcus, creativity was merely a spreadsheet metric, but the board had demanded a fresh perspective, forcing him to open the floor to everyone, including the lowest-tier interns. For Maya, this anonymous submission box was a beacon in the dark. It was her only chance to bypass the crushing prejudice of her superiors. Stripped of her name, her age, and her intern status, her words would have to stand on their own. She decided to pour her soul into a pitch she titled The Invisible Threads. It was a campaign concept focused entirely on the profound, often ignored connections between isolated, exhausted people living in a hyper-busy urban landscape. She wrote it not from textbooks but from the raw, bleeding edges of her own life, using her secret, sleepless nights in a billionaire's penthouse to draft a manifesto about empathy, unseen struggles, and the quiet dignity of surviving in the dark. Because she was forbidden to make noise, Maya would sit on the cold floor of Julian's kitchen after her cleaning duties were done, balancing her cracked second-hand laptop on her knees, typing furiously in the dim light while Leo slept nearby. Ironically, the very environment created by the cold, unfeeling CEO became the incubator for a campaign designed to thaw his company's frozen public image. When Julian, sitting alone in his top-floor office, eventually reviewed the anonymized digital stack of submissions, Maya's draft stopped him cold. Amidst a sea of corporate jargon and sterile marketing strategies, her proposal pulsed with a desperate, beautiful heartbeat. It spoke of shared silences and the invisible burdens people carry, concepts that resonated violently with the strange, unacknowledged domestic life he was secretly harboring in his own home. He immediately fast-tracked the anonymous file to the top of the development pile, completely unaware that the brilliant, empathetic mind he was seeking belonged to the exhausted girl scrubbing his floors. That same week, Seattle was battered by an atmospheric river, a relentless deluge that turned the city into a submerged grey blur. The torrential rain matched the brutal storm raging inside Julian's own body. He had contracted a virulent strain of the flu, but his pathological need for control refused to let him rest. Late one Tuesday night, the penthouse was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic, heavy thud of the rain against the panoramic windows. Julian sat slumped over the massive kitchen island, surrounded by scattered financial reports and an empty glass of water. His normally pristine charcoal trousers were wrinkled, his tie was discarded, and his tailored white shirt clung to his back, damp with a feverish sweat. His face was dangerously pale, his sharp cheekbones flushed with an unnatural burning heat. When Maya quietly slipped out of the service elevator just past midnight, carrying her bucket and supplies, she froze in the doorway. She had expected him to be securely locked away in his study, as he always was. Instead, the terrifying CEO was collapsed over his own marble counter, his breathing shallow and rattling, clearly incapacitated by a soaring fever. Panic seized Maya's throat. Her strict contract dictated absolute invisibility. Interacting with him, let alone witnessing his vulnerability, was a fireable offense. She took a step back, intending to hide in the laundry room until he woke up and left. But as Julian let out a low, pained groan, shivering violently despite the ambient warmth of the room, Maya's deeply ingrained nurturing instincts, the same instincts that kept her baby brother alive, overrode her fear. Moving with silent, practiced efficiency, she abandoned her mop. She navigated the expansive, state-of-the-art kitchen, locating a hidden pantry and the refrigerator. Using a few high-end ingredients she found, organic chicken stock, fresh herbs, and some leftover roasted vegetables, she quietly simmered a restorative, nutrient-dense broth. She then tiptoed into the guest bathroom, digging through the immaculate medicine cabinet, until she found a blister pack of heavy-duty flu medication. She poured the steaming, fragrant soup into a ceramic bowl, placed the pills and a glass of fresh water on a tray, and crept toward the island. She set the tray down just inches from his resting head. At that exact moment, the carefully constructed boundaries of their parallel worlds shattered. Leo, who had been resting on a makeshift bed of Maya's folded jackets in the corner, woke up. Disoriented by the new environment and the sound of the storm, the 2-year-old toddler rubbed his eyes and waddled unsteadily across the hardwood floor. Maya, terrified, reached out to intercept him, but she was too slow. Leo padded right up to the towering kitchen island. Standing on his tiptoes, he peered over the edge at the strange, sick man slumped on the stool. Driven by the innocent, uncorrupted empathy of a child, Leo reached out his tiny, warm, chubby hand and firmly wrapped his fingers around Julian's pale, shivering index finger resting on the marble. The unexpected, scorching warmth of the toddler's touch sent a physical shockwave through Julian's fever-addled nervous system. His heavy eyelids fluttered open, his grey eyes glazed and unfocused. For a terrifying, disorienting second, Julian was no longer a 30-year-old billionaire in a luxury penthouse. The fever dragged him back 20 years into the brutal, unforgiving stone corridors of St. Jude's boarding academy. He was 10 years old again, burning with a dangerous fever in a sterile infirmary bed, entirely alone. He remembered the echoing footsteps of matron Beatrice, a tall, skeletal woman with a face like a dried plum and a heart just as shriveled. Her only response to a frightened, sick child was to toss a cold, damp cloth onto his forehead and deliver a stern, emotionless lecture on fortitude and the weakness of tears before locking him in the dark room for the night. Julian had learned then that sickness was a vulnerability, and vulnerability invited abandonment. But now, anchored by the tiny, anchoring grip of a toddler's hand, the cold nightmare receded. Julian slowly turned his head, his hazy gaze dropping to the little boy staring back at him with wide, solemn eyes, and then shifting to the steaming bowl of soup and the terrified hovering figure of Maya. He didn't yell, he didn't fire her. He just stared at the soup, the first meal anyone had cooked specifically to care for him in over 2 decades, before his eyes rolled back and he slipped into a deep, exhausted sleep, his finger still loosely curled around Leo's hand. The following night, Maya rode the service elevator up to the penthouse with a knot of pure dread in her stomach. She was convinced that this was it. She had crossed the line, she had been seen, and her termination papers would be waiting on the counter. The apartment was empty, the air still and quiet. Julian was presumably recovering in his master suite, hidden behind locked doors. Maya walked into the kitchen, bracing herself for the worst. Instead, she found the kitchen island completely clear save for the washed and dried soup bowl. However, the floor, near the corner where she usually laid Leo down to sleep, was entirely different. Sitting in a haphazard pile was a massive, ultra-plush, memory foam playmat, thick enough to rival a high-end mattress. Scattered carelessly across it were several boxes of incredibly expensive, educational wooden toddler toys, still wrapped in their premium packaging. Slapped aggressively onto the center of the plush mat was a bright yellow post-it note written in Julian's sharp, jagged, impatient handwriting. Maya knelt down, her hands trembling, as she peeled the note off. It read, "Found this company trash cluttering the lobby. Get it out of my sight and keep the boy off the bare floor." Maya stared at the note, a tear escaping her eye and tracing a hot path down her cheek. She looked at the luxurious, ridiculously soft mat and the fortune in toys, realizing, that the terrifying ice-cold CEO of Vance Media had just bought her brother a safe haven, masking his profound act of kindness behind his usual armor of corporate irritability. She carefully laid the sleeping Leo onto the plush surface, the boy instantly sinking comfortably into the foam with a soft sigh. As Maya picked up her mop to start her shift, she looked toward the dark hallway leading to Julian's room, knowing with absolute certainty that the thick, impenetrable ice surrounding Julian Vance had finally begun to crack. The fluorescent lights of the fourth-floor intern bullpen flickered with a sterile, unforgiving hum, casting harsh shadows over rows of identical grey cubicles. The air here was always thick with a toxic blend of caffeine, desperate ambition, and unspoken rivalries. It was an ecosystem designed to weed out the weak, and at the absolute top of this predatory food chain sat Chloe Sterling. Chloe was 22, the epitome of inherited corporate privilege. Standing at 5'9" with cascading salon-perfect blonde hair and a wardrobe exclusively funded by her father's lucrative hedge fund, she treated the Vance Media internship not as a learning experience, but as a guaranteed coronation. She possessed a ruthless, venomous ambition perfectly camouflaged behind a pristine, glossy smile and a habit of referring to everyone as sweetie. Chloe lacked any genuine creative talent, but she was a master of corporate espionage and taking credit for others' labor. Recently, the entire floor had been buzzing with rumors about Julian Vance's intense interest in the anonymous submission box. Chloe, desperate to secure a permanent executive role, had been hunting for the author of the rumored leading pitch, The Invisible Threads. Her predatory instincts eventually zeroed in on the quiet, exhausted girl who always sat in the corner. Maya was running on fumes. The physical toll of her secret night shifts at the penthouse, combined with the crushing anxiety of the impending Child Protective Services deadline, had pushed her to the absolute brink of human endurance. During a brief 10-minute lunch break, Maya had accidentally dozed off at her desk, her head resting on her folded arms. She hadn't realized that the zipper of her worn tote bag was slightly open. Chloe, gliding past with a green juice in hand, paused. Her sharp, pale blue eyes caught sight of something sticking out of Maya's bag. With the stealth of a viper, Chloe slipped 2 fingers in and pulled out a laminated ID badge from Midnight Maid's cleaning services bearing Maya's photo. Beneath it was a crumpled daycare invoice addressed to Maya, listing Leo's name. Chloe's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up. The pieces clicked together in her malicious mind, forming a twisted, entirely inaccurate narrative. She assumed the young, impoverished black intern had an illegitimate child out of wedlock and was secretly scrubbing toilets to pay for it. It was the perfect leverage. Later that afternoon, Chloe cornered Maya in the empty employee break room. The hum of the vending machines was the only sound as Chloe leaned against the counter, twirling the stolen cleaning badge around her manicured finger. "You know, sweetie, I always wondered why you look like a walking corpse," Chloe purred, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Maya's heart slammed into her ribs, her breath hitching as she saw the badge. "Give that back," Maya demanded, her voice shaking as she reached for it. Chloe snatched it away, stepping closer, dropping the sweet facade entirely. "Here is how this is going to work, Maya. I know you wrote The Invisible Threads. I saw the draft on your screen yesterday. You are going to log into the portal and transfer the authorship of that submission to me. If you don't, I'm going straight to Sarah in HR. I will tell her you're moonlighting as a scrub maid, which violates the intern exhaustion clause. And I'll make sure everyone in this building knows about your little bastard child. How long do you think you can keep that kid if you lose this job?" Maya was pushed violently to the wall. The threat wasn't just about losing her internship. It was a direct threat to Leo's safety. She stood frozen, paralyzed by a suffocating wave of panic and absolute despair, the walls of the small room feeling as though they were closing in to crush her. Before Maya could formulate a response, the break room door swung open. It was Sarah, the Director of Human Resources, her acrylic nails tapping against her tablet. She didn't even acknowledge Chloe. "Maya!" Sarah barked, her tone clipped and impatient. "Mr. Vance wants to see you in his office. Immediately." Chloe's eyes widened in shock, but Maya felt nothing but a cold, heavy dread. The CEO wanted to see her. Chloe had been right. He must have traced the IP address of the anonymous submission. Maya blindly followed Sarah toward the executive elevators, her mind spiraling. She was going to be fired. She was going to lose Leo. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an ascent to the guillotine. Julian Vance's top-floor office was a massive, intimidating fortress of glass and dark mahogany suspended high above the Seattle skyline. The storm from the previous days had broken, leaving the city bathed in a stark, blindingly clear afternoon light that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian stood with his back to the door, staring out at the skyscrapers. His fever had broken completely, leaving his mind razor-sharp, but the lingering emotional resonance of that night in his kitchen had permanently altered the rigid architecture of his thoughts. He was waiting for the brilliant, empathetic mind behind the invisible threads. He expected a seasoned copywriter hiding in the lower ranks, someone with years of hidden life experience. He heard the heavy oak door open and close, signaling the arrival of his mysterious author. "Take a seat," Julian said, his voice carrying its usual commanding authority, though lacking the freezing edge it normally possessed. He turned around, expecting to formally congratulate a hidden talent. When his eyes landed on the figure standing nervously by the door, the breath was completely knocked out of his lungs. Maya stood there, drowning in her oversized, thrift store blazer. She looked terrifyingly fragile under the harsh daylight. For a long, suspended moment, the air in the massive office stopped circulating. They simply stared at each other, the reality of their two parallel worlds violently colliding in the dead center of the executive suite. Julian's brilliant, analytical mind raced, rapidly connecting the impossible dots. The exhausted intern he had brushed past in the hallway. The desperate girls scrubbing his marble floors in the dead of night. The author of the most profoundly empathetic corporate strategy he had ever read. They were all the exact same person. Maya kept her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide her trembling. She was waiting for the inevitable dismissal, waiting for the cold CEO to throw her out of his pristine tower. Julian slowly walked around his massive desk, his eyes never leaving her face. As he approached, the stark daylight illuminated details the dark kitchen had hidden. He saw the deep, purple bruises of exhaustion under her eyes. He saw the sheer terror vibrating through her small frame. And then his gaze dropped to her hands. Wrapped haphazardly around her left wrist was a cheap, generic bandage, poorly concealing an angry, red burn blister. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. His mind instantly flashed back to the previous night at the penthouse. He remembered Maya standing by the industrial hot water dispenser, struggling to make a bottle of formula for the toddler while trying to remain absolutely silent. She had fumbled, and the boiling water had splashed directly onto her wrist. She hadn't made a sound. She had simply bitten her lip, wrapped it in a paper towel, and gone back to scrubbing his floor. The silence in the office was deafening. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the harsh words. But when Julian finally spoke, his voice was not a weapon. It was quiet, incredibly thick, and laced with an emotion that the CEO of Vance Media had never displayed in this building. "How many hours of sleep do you get a day, Maya?" Maya's eyes snapped open in sheer shock. She looked up, expecting to see a trap, but Julian wasn't looking at her like a CEO looking at a disposable intern. He was looking at her wrist. He was looking at the human cost of the empire he had built. The question hung in the air, a profound shattering of the corporate ice. He wasn't asking about her anonymous draft. He wasn't asking about deadlines or metrics. For the first time in his entire adult life, the cold, untouchable Julian Vance was asking about the survival of the person standing right in front of him. The aftermath of their confrontation in the executive suite had left a profound, irreversible shift in the atmosphere of Vance Media. Following the revelation of Maya's grueling double life and the burn on her wrist, Julian had immediately ordered her to go home in his private town car, commanding her to take a fully paid week off to prepare for her impending custody hearing. However, in her absence, the venomous underbelly of the corporate hierarchy made its move. The sky above Seattle had already begun to turn a bruised, ominous purple, signaling the arrival of a historic winter front when Julian received an urgent alert from his cybersecurity team. The proprietary files for The Invisible Threads, the campaign that was supposed to save the company, had been unlawfully copied and emailed to a major rival media conglomerate. The digital footprints were arrogant and sloppy, tracing directly back to the IP address of a workstation on the 4th floor. Julian summoned the culprit to his office. Chloe Sterling walked in with her signature glossy smile, wearing a designer winter coat, entirely confident that she was untouchable. "You wanted to see me, Julian?" she asked, using his first name with unearned familiarity. Julian did not offer her a seat. He simply turned his laptop around, displaying the undeniable access logs. Chloe's smile fractured. She instantly launched into a desperate, venomous defense, attempting to frame the absent Maya. "It was the intern," Chloe stammered, her voice pitching higher. "Maya Hayes. She's unstable, Julian. She even has a secret kid and scrubs toilets at night. She must have sold it because she needs the money." Julian's eyes grew so cold they seemed to drop the temperature in the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your employment at Vance Media is terminated immediately," Julian stated, his tone a lethal, quiet blade. "Security is packing your desk. Furthermore, if you ever speak Maya Hayes' name again, I will personally ensure your father's hedge fund is subjected to a forensic audit that will leave your family bankrupt. Get out." As a pale, trembling Chloe was escorted out of the building, Julian picked up his private phone and dialed a number he rarely used. He called Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was Julian's personal attorney and the most feared family law litigator in the Pacific Northwest. In his late 60s, Arthur was a man of impeccable posture, always dressed in custom-tailored three-piece wool suits, possessing a head of thick silver hair and the shrewd, calculating eyes of a hawk. Despite his ruthless courtroom reputation, Arthur harbored a grandfatherly loyalty to Julian, having known him since his lonely boarding school days. "Arthur," Julian said, staring out at the first heavy flakes of snow beginning to fall against the glass, "I need your services for a highly sensitive personal matter. A young woman in my employ is facing a CPS custody hearing next week. Her situation is precarious. I want you to build an impenetrable legal fortress around her. Spare absolutely no expense. Prepare a portfolio that proves she has undeniable financial stability and top-tier legal backing. I am giving her a gift, and I want the state to be terrified to even question her rights." Arthur simply chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Consider it done, Julian. It's about time you used your war chest for something with a heartbeat. By nightfall, the predicted winter front hit Seattle not as a storm, but as an apocalyptic whiteout. The blizzard howled through the urban canyons, dumping feet of snow and paralyzing the entire city grid. Public transit was completely halted, and the mayor declared a state of emergency. Inside the fortified climate-controlled sanctuary of his penthouse, Julian paced the hardwood floors. It was past midnight. According to the cleaning agency's schedule, Maya was not supposed to be here, having been given the week off. Yet the absolute silence of the apartment gnawed at him. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the blizzard against the glass only amplified his sudden, acute anxiety. He knew the Rainier Valley district where Maya lived. It had an aging power grid that failed during heavy rain, let alone a historic blizzard. The image of the exhausted girl and the quiet toddler trapped in a freezing, dilapidated studio flashed through his mind. Julian Vance, a man who had built an entire life on the foundation of absolute non-involvement, suddenly stopped pacing. He grabbed his heavy cashmere overcoat, snatched his car keys, and broke every single rule he had ever set for himself. Navigating the treacherous, snow-choked streets of Seattle in a customized, heavy-duty Range Rover, Julian fought his way through the whiteout. The city was a ghost town, abandoned to the ice. When he finally reached the address listed in Maya's employee file, his heart sank. The apartment building was a crumbling, grim structure, and just as he had feared, it was completely engulfed in darkness. The power grid had failed. Julian forced the jammed front door open with his shoulder and climbed the dark, freezing stairwell to the third floor, using the flashlight on his phone. He pounded on the flimsy wooden door of apartment 3B. When there was no answer, he didn't hesitate. He kicked the door right above the deadbolt. The frame splintered, and the door swung open. The air inside the tiny apartment was bitterly cold, so frigid that Julian could see his own breath. In the corner of the dark room, huddled on a thin, sunken mattress, was Maya. She was wrapped in every cheap blanket and worn sweater she owned, but she wasn't shivering for herself. She was desperately clutching Leo to her chest. The toddler was completely listless. His small face flushed a dangerous bright red, radiating a terrifying heat that contrasted violently with the freezing room. Maya looked up, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely hollowed out by despair. When she saw the silhouette of Julian Vance standing in her broken doorway, a towering savior in a tailored coat, she let out a broken, helpless sob. "He's burning up," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The power went out. I couldn't get a taxi. I didn't know what to do." Julian moved with the swift, decisive efficiency of a CEO managing a crisis, but his hands were incredibly gentle. He stripped off his heavy cashmere overcoat and wrapped it tightly around both Maya and the feverish toddler, cocooning them in thick, expensive warmth. "You don't need to figure it out anymore," Julian said, his voice a steady, unbreakable anchor in the freezing dark. He reached down and scooped Leo up into his own arms, pressing the burning child against his chest before taking Maya's trembling hand. "Come with me. Now." He guided them through the blizzard, securing them in the heated leather interior of his SUV, and drove them straight back to the impenetrable safety of his penthouse. The moment the heavy door of the apartment clicked shut, the howling of the storm was completely muted, replaced by the warm, quiet hum of the climate control. Julian immediately directed Maya to the luxurious guest suite. She tried to protest, attempting to reach for her brother, but Julian stopped her with a gentle, firm hand on her shoulder. "Maya, look at me," he commanded softly. "You are completely exhausted. You are no good to him if you collapse. I have doctors on call if his fever spikes, and I know exactly what to do. Get in that bed and sleep. That is an order." Maya looked into his grey eyes, finding no trace of the cold, ruthless boss she had feared for months. She only saw a man offering a desperate, genuine sanctuary. The adrenaline that had kept her going for months finally evaporated, and she nodded weakly, collapsing onto the impossibly soft mattress. She was asleep before Julian even pulled the heavy duvet over her shoulders. Julian carried Leo into his own study. He laid the plush memory foam mat on the floor near his desk, placing the toddler gently upon it. For the rest of the night, while the blizzard raged and buried the city in ice, the arrogant, untouchable CEO of Vance Media did not look at a single stock metric or read a single email. He sat on the floor, his sleeves rolled up, a basin of cool water by his side. Hour after hour, he meticulously and tenderly applied a damp, cool washcloth to Leo's burning forehead, smoothing back the boy's dark curls. He listened to the child's ragged breathing, slowly steady and calm as the fever broke. In the quiet hours just before dawn, as Leo's small, warm hand blindly reached out and curled around Julian's thumb in his sleep, Julian realized that the icy fortress he had lived in his entire life had completely melted away, leaving behind something entirely new, terrifying and profoundly warm. The morning after the historic blizzard, Seattle was a blinding expanse of pristine, untouched white, sparkling under a brilliant, apologetic sun that reflected fiercely off the surrounding skyscrapers. Inside the Vance penthouse, Maya Hayes woke up slowly, her body heavy with the first genuine, uninterrupted rest she had experienced in over a year. She sat up in the luxurious guest bed, a moment of sheer panic seizing her chest as she remembered the howling storm, the terrifying power outage, and Leo's soaring fever. Throwing off the heavy duvet, she rushed down the hallway toward the kitchen. She stopped dead at the entrance. The harsh, clinical perfection of Julian's sanctuary had been thoroughly disrupted in the most beautiful way imaginable. Sitting on the thick memory foam mat in the corner was Leo, his fever completely broken, giggling brightly as he clumsily stacked expensive wooden blocks. Sitting cross-legged on the floor right next to him, still wearing his wrinkled trousers and a rolled-up dress shirt from the night before, was Julian Vance. The notoriously ice-cold CEO was patiently handing the toddler a blue block. When Julian noticed Maya, he stood up, his joints popping slightly from a night spent on the hardwood, but his grey eyes were remarkably clear and entirely devoid of their usual freezing edge. His temperature returned to normal around 4 in the morning, Julian said quietly, anticipating her panicked question. Maya rushed forward, dropping to her knees and burying her face in Leo's soft, dark curls, tears of profound relief sliding down her cheeks. Julian watched them, a quiet resolve settling over his sharp features. He walked over to the marble island, picking up a sleek manila folder. "Maya, stand up," he instructed, his tone shifting back to business, but carrying an underlying supportive warmth. She stood, wiping her eyes, bracing for the awkward reality of returning to her lowly intern status. Julian handed her the folder. "As of this morning, your contract with Midnight Maids is officially terminated. You are no longer scrubbing floors. Inside is your new employment contract. You are now the lead project manager for the Invisible Threads campaign, effective immediately, complete with a full executive salary, comprehensive corporate benefits, and a dedicated workspace on my floor. You are a brilliant strategist, Maya. It's time you were compensated for it." Maya stared at the 6-figure salary printed on the heavy cardstock, her breath catching in her throat as the suffocating weight of her financial terror simply evaporated into the sunlit air. 3 days later, the sterile, intimidating halls of the King County family court felt like an active battlefield. Maya sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling in her lap, despite the impeccable new designer suit Julian had insisted she purchase for the occasion. Across the aisle sat Mrs. Brenda Higgins from Child Protective Services, looking as rigid and bureaucratic as ever, clutching her clipboard. Presiding over the hearing was the Honourable Judge Eleanor Vance, no relation to Julian, a formidable woman in her late 60s with piercing dark eyes, a crown of tightly coiled grey hair, and a terrifying reputation for having absolutely zero tolerance for unpreparedness. She peered over her reading glasses, ready to deliver a harsh, clinical verdict on the impoverished 22-year-old. But before Mrs. Higgins could even present her case regarding Maya's previously dilapidated living conditions, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a dramatic thud. In strode Arthur Pendleton, Julian's elite personal attorney, looking like a silver-haired shark in a bespoke three-piece suit. He approached the bench with an air of absolute, unshakable authority. "Your Honour, Arthur Pendleton representing Miss Hayes," he announced, his gravelly voice echoing in the silent room. "Mrs." Higgins's jaw practically hit the floor. Arthur Pendleton was a legal titan who usually only handled billionaire divorces and corporate mergers. Arthur smoothly presented a thick, leather-bound dossier to the judge. "Your Honour, you will find enclosed Miss Hayes' new employment contract as a senior executive at Vance Media, confirming an income that places her well within the top percentile of this city. Furthermore, we have provided deeds to a newly leased, highly secure, family-friendly townhome in Queen Anne, fully paid for the next 3 years. Arthur then stepped aside, gesturing elegantly toward the back of the courtroom. "And finally, Your Honour, as a character witness and official financial guarantor, I present the CEO of Vance Media, Mr. Julian Vance." Julian, looking devastatingly sharp in a dark navy suit, stepped forward from the gallery, offering a curt, respectful nod to the judge. The entire courtroom was stunned into absolute silence. Judge Eleanor reviewed the impeccably prepared documents, her stern expression softening into a rare, genuine smile of approval. "Well, Ms. Hayes," the judge declared, striking her wooden gavel with a decisive crack, "it appears your circumstances have remarkably improved. The state has no further concerns. Permanent custody of Leo Hayes is hereby formally granted to his sister." Maya collapsed back into her wooden chair, covering her face as a loud, tearing sob of pure joy ripped from her throat, while Julian stood quietly at the back, a protective sentinel watching her, finally, win her freedom. Fast forward 3 months, and the corporate landscape of Vance Media was completely unrecognizable. The Invisible Threads campaign had launched globally, and it was a monumental, historic success. The raw, deeply empathetic messaging had struck a profound chord with a burned-out, isolated society, single-handedly salvaging the corporation's reputation and driving public engagement through the roof. Maya had proven herself to be a visionary leader, commanding the boardroom with a quiet, unshakable grace that earned her the respect of the very executives who had once ignored her. But the most shocking transformation was not the surging stock price, it was the CEO himself. On a crisp Friday morning, Julian called a mandatory company-wide assembly in the grand lobby. Standing beside Maya, he addressed the hundreds of employees who had once feared his very footsteps. "For years, this company demanded your time at the expense of your humanity," Julian's voice rang out, clear and remarkably steady. "We are changing the blueprint." He pressed a button on his remote, dropping a massive velvet curtain that had been concealing the mezzanine level. It was no longer a sterile labyrinth of grey cubicles. Julian had ordered the entire second floor gutted and transformed into a state-of-the-art, 5-star corporate daycare and early learning center, completely free for all employees. Through the glass walls, staff could see brightly colored indoor playgrounds, plush sleeping rooms, quiet reading nooks, and a staff of top-tier pediatric nurses. It was a staggering multi-million-dollar investment in the well-being of his workforce. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers and applause, some exhausted parents weeping openly at the sight. Julian turned his head slightly, his grey eyes catching Maya's. He didn't need to say a single word. They both knew this massive sanctuary of childhood joy was a direct, living tribute to a resilient girl who had scrubbed his floors and a 2-year-old boy whose tiny hand had melted a frozen heart. That evening, the Seattle sky was painted in breathtaking strokes of bruised violet, burning orange, and soft pink as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Olympic Mountains. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was entirely different from the silent, terrifying tomb it had once been. The sterile perfection was permanently gone, replaced by the beautiful, chaotic warmth of life. Leo was sitting on his luxurious memory foam mat in the living room, happily babbling to a new stuffed bear. Maya stood in the kitchen, casually leaning against the pristine marble island, holding a half-empty glass of red wine. She wore a soft, oversized cashmere sweater, her face glowing with genuine peace and healthy color. Julian stood right beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His collar was open, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the relaxed posture of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own humanity. They watched the sunset in a comfortable, companionable silence, listening to the soft sounds of Leo playing behind them. Julian looked down at the immaculate marble counter, tracing an invisible line with his index finger before he slowly turned his head to look at Maya. The fading golden sunlight caught the profound, undeniable tenderness in his grey eyes. "You know," Julian murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble that seemed to vibrate in the quiet space between them. "I used to think absolute silence was the only way to keep the chaos out." He paused, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her warm brown eyes again. "But this kitchen, if there are 2 more people in it, it feels much warmer." Maya's breath hitched softly in her throat. She didn't look away, nor did she step back. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, mirroring the soft, hopeful light of the Seattle sunset. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his on the cool marble. As the last rays of the sun faded into twilight, leaving the penthouse bathed in a soft, golden glow, the future stretched out before them, no longer a rigid corporate blueprint, but a beautiful, unwritten open door. As we reach the end of this journey, the story of Julian and Maya leaves us with a gentle reminder for our own lives. We often build thick walls of ice around our hearts to protect ourselves from the chaos and stress of the modern world. We focus so much on our own survival, our careers, and our daily routines that we forget to see the invisible threads connecting us to the people right next to us. Maya and Leo teach us that even in our most exhausted and desperate moments, our quiet resilience and love can melt the coldest of environments. On the other hand, Julian reminds us that it is never too late to tear down the walls we have built and use whatever strength or resources we have to create a sanctuary for someone else. In your everyday life, you will undoubtedly cross paths with people who are fighting a bitter storm you know nothing about. A small act of kindness, a moment of patience, or simply choosing to truly see them can change the entire blueprint of their world. True wealth and success are never found in an empty, silent room, but in a space filled with warmth, shared burdens, and the people we choose to care for. If this story brought a little light to your day or touched your heart, please share it with a friend or family member who might need to hear it right now. Leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts on Julian and Maya, and please subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing these meaningful stories to you. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He grant you the strength to weather whatever storms you are facing today, and the grace to be a safe haven for those who need you. If you believe in the healing power of compassion and second chances, please type Amen in the comments below.